So my presentation is on living with the motor car, which was a February 1964 RACV traffic symposium, quite a huge event in Melbourne at the time. And I'm looking at it from a variety of points of view. So I'm looking at the environment in terms of transport planning and traffic engineering at the time. I want to consider it in the history of RACV's historical role of advocacy. I want to look at the key recommendations of the speakers. They were quite at odds with each other, which must have made it a very interesting symposium. And I want to look at which proposals were actually taken up by the RACV particularly and propagated and advocated through different channels after the symposium and how that made a bit of a difference, I think, in the outcomes. For those of you who aren't from Melbourne, RACV is the Royal Automobile Club of Victoria, and there's an automobile club in each state. Okay, so why did RACV host the symposium? Well, it did have a long history of advocating for improved conditions for motorists. There was a huge interest, of course, in the post-World War II era in town planning and transport engineering as disciplines, and they were growing as new disciplines. There was a realisation that the role of the car in the city was not just an issue that affected motorists, but the whole of society. So there was a huge fear of stagnating cities with poor mobility, increasing congestion, and the development of what was described at the time as urban slums that were just dominated by ineffective transport systems. For RACV, it was a very fitting way to celebrate their 60th year, and they saw it as a contribution to the Victorian community. And they were in a very good position to actually stage this conference because they had this whole international network that was available to them through other automobile associations, so other associations internationally, and there was a huge amount of dialogue that happened between particularly Britain and America in terms of sharing knowledge. And this was a time in the early 60s when debates about the future of urban transport really reached a climax, and there was quite a lot of heated discussion about the relevant issues. So, going way back to 1903, I just want to explore this idea of advocacy and how it fits into RACV's history. Going way back to the establishment of RACV in 1903, and it was the Automobile Club of Victoria then, 6 of the objects of the club, 3 of them were about roads, improving transport, encouraging the improvement, construction and maintenance of roads and highways, securing rational legislation, and maintaining the lawful rights and privileges and protecting the interests of motorists. So this was very much consistently pursued through the organisation for 6 decades before we come to this conference era. And in terms of the kinds of ideas that they were looking at, from very early on, it was a very basic improvement of roads. So this is their magazine from 1912 saying this is not a ploughed field, it's the main street of Oakley, and it's only 15 miles from the GPO. They wanted to introduce uniform traffic signage. I'm not sure whether the hieroglyphics they recommended would have been very easy to remember, especially to a young motorist, but some people have better memories than I do. It's interesting to me that from very early on, they were looking at the idea of the multi-level city in terms of improved transport by actually separating the transport corridors. So you have different levels for pedestrians, for slow motor traffic, for fast motor traffic, for electric trains. And of course, you need to have your airfield landing aircraft landing space on top of your high-rise buildings. So this is, for Melbourne back in 1927, this is pretty innovative. And they were looking, of course, at international examples, how London might tackle its traffic problem with a new bridge over Charing Cross Street near the Thames. We were probably all glad that didn't happen. And of course, you know, this is coming straight from Europe, from the key thinkers in terms of urban planning, urban design and transport planning in the 1920s. People like Le Corbusier in particular, who looks at this idea of the multi-level city and also the idea of the necessity of having aircraft landing spaces in the middle of your towns. So this comes through in the journal. The RACV had a journal back from 1922 looking at the idea of elevated highways in New York, looking at with almost like we'd say lust at the highways that the Germans had in the late 1930s, bringing up again and again the theme of having multi-level railway systems. advocating for pedestrian walkways at first floor level in the CBD to improve the safety of pedestrians and also the flow of traffic. Looking ahead to the design of the highway of the future with built-in chauffeuring services, so that we're looking towards autonomous transport here. And of course, it'd be nice to play, board games in the car when you're going on your family holidays. So it was very, innovative and forward-thinking and quite futuristic. And of course, this era is following on from the 1954 Melbourne Metropolitan Planning Scheme, which wasn't seen as being a huge success in the city. So this was 1954. There was a bit of a backlash from RACV afterwards because it was felt that the planning scheme hadn't really met the needs of the city at the time. So RACV saw that there was a lack of effective solutions for key problems identified in the report, including sprawling low-density development, a decline in the residential amenity of inner-city suburbs, CBD congestion, and the increasing difficulty in the movement of people and goods. Of course, it did propose a ring road around Melbourne, and RACV kept on for years saying, when is this going to happen? When is this going to be built? And it really used a raw auto to, ramp things up a bit. This is a cartoon showing how difficult it is for motorists to actually get to the CBD and actually park when they get there. This is a cartoon looking at planners and how inadequate their process was for dealing with all these different kind of recommendations and proposals that weren't fundamentally very efficient and successful. Again, advocating for these changes to happen. And I think in terms of why this was such an important symposium and why it was pushed so hard was that our traffic committee chairman was Sir Cecil Looker, who was quite an important person in Melbourne at the time. He had very strong connections. He had started off earlier on as being the private secretary to Sir Robert Menzies, who was the Prime Minister, so he had very good political connections. He'd attempted to have 2 seats as a Liberal candidate, which wasn't successful. He went on to work for Ian Potter later, became a huge financialist. So he was very, very well connected. And he kept on advocating for major changes to happen in Melbourne transport and Australian transport. And looking at the minutes of the RACV, almost a third of them over this period are the traffic committee reports. The traffic engineer says this. And it almost reads like a set of instructions from an executive to their staff. We told the Melbourne City Council they need to do this. And the next meeting is, well, they've told us they've done it, but now we want them to do this. It was quite an interesting relationship. Anyway, I can't go into that now, but it's very interesting. So our Premier, Henry Bolte, opened the symposium. It was held at the Sutherland Cross Hotel, and 350 delegates attended. So pretty much RACV invited all the movers and shakers in the community at the time, politicians, road authorities, municipalities, professional institutions, industry organisations and so on. And the 4 key themes of the symposium were the integration of transport forms, the relationship between transport and town planning, financing and implementing city transport, and transport in the city of the future. And RACV had very well articulated objectives, I guess, that it wanted to be met through these discussions. So how to produce adequate road systems that would provide for ever-increasing transportation needs, how to ensure that the motor car works in combination with other methods of transportation to ensure that traffic moves quickly, safely and efficiently, and it really wanted one central authority for roads to make things work. The information was disseminated afterwards through Royal Auto articles and also through a nicely published book, which you can all look at later. So there were 2 principal keynote speakers, Professor Colin Buchanan, who was a Professor of Transport at the Imperial College, the University of London, and Burton W Marsh. So it was Britain versus America, really, this conference. So I'll introduce Professor Colin Buchanan first. He was the author of Traffic in Towns, 1963, which was a study made at the request of the British Minister of Transport on the future of motor traffic in towns. He was an engineer. He had a lot of confidence in the ability of engineers to solve urban problems, but he was also keen to preserve what he saw as a social, historical organisation of the city and the street. So he had this idea of the community being really at risk through the intervention of the car and transport routes through urban places and societies. And he wasn't, backward in saying this. He said if it was not restrained, the car would kill the street. So this was his argument. A lot of the suggestions he made at the symposium have been sort of adopted over the last 50 years, are forward-thinking. Road pricing, taxes on congestion, traffic quietening routes and electric tollways were some of his ideas. He was very concerned about the environmental pollution caused by cars in cities, the adverse effects of motor traffic in terms of danger, noise, fumes, vibration, and intrusion into the visual scene. And he was quite a poetic character. He quoted Rupert Brooks in his keynote address and talking about the sort of idyllic British village life. And I really see his ideas really come from a deep-seated culture and a deep-seated sort of aesthetic perspective of the picturesque, this idea, and a nostalgic view to a Britain pre-war that hadn't been devastated. This idea of holding the community together, kind of keeping the historic streetscape intact was very important. So his solutions were to look at urban design principles that were based on the idea of rooms, to having areas where people kind of had their traditional life kept intact, but transport corridors placed around the outside so that you had the least possible intrusion to the urban environment as possible. So interesting for a traffic engineer, I would say. And that was his key priority. I'll just show you. So he was the one, urban areas could become motor slums. And should the car, in spite of its enormous utility, make a mockery of things that have been held dear in towns for generations? So that was his perspective, although he also did like the multi-levelled city. So Burton W Marsh on the right is the second keynote speaker. He was the American. He was a very gung-ho traffic engineer, and he was just all in favour of increasing the flow of traffic along the city's arteries no matter what. It was radical surgery. It was just, let's make things move. So that was his philosophy. And he advocated a lot of ways of managing traffic in the US which were not necessarily known of or adopted in Australia at the time. So things like reversible lane operation, increasing the use of one-way street systems, the increasing use of channelization, so creating channelizing islands that make traffic flow better. Speed zoning shouldn't be excessively implemented, which is kind of interesting for our current era. And quoting all the studies, it says excessively low speeds actually don't improve safety. The use of exclusive bus lanes, through street systems, so coordinated traffic lights, clearways at heavy traffic times, prohibition of left, in our case, right-hand turns during peak hours and so on. He did like total flow reversal, and he stated, the scheme works well, and to my great surprise, there have not been many serious accidents at or near changeover times. So a total flow reversal is really great, and nowadays I sort of wonder how many serious accidents constitute a problem. I don't know, but he wasn't very clear on that. So he was very, very popular at the conference. And he doesn't really look at the influence on society and the influence on pedestrians in the city at all. They don't really seem to be a huge concern. And I think these two themes are the ones that really come out of the conference strongly. We've got these two advocates, very different positions. There's a cultural pull towards the British sort of model of village life, I guess, but actually the excitement is for the modern world. And people, want American transport, American cars, American fastness, American glamour. And Buchanan really gets a little bit, his voice is a bit subdued, even though he's a very strong speaker. Okay, so these are his ideas. And there's lots of kind of glamorous images of the sexy traffic control centres that are used in the States and how efficient and streamlined and scientific they are. And we see all these illustrations of how we can actually improve our systems in the same way that the Americans have. Ramp signals were advocated back in the early 1960s, which is interesting. I think we only had them recently in Melbourne, relatively recently. And look at models of how expressways can be built and so on with bus interchanges, etc., etc., etc. So they were very well illustrated as well, these publications. So I'm just going to really skip through, give you an idea of some of the, quickly, other key speakers. So our own Victorian Minister for Transport, Meagher, had an interesting proposal that we actually just put all the railways underground, and then we actually make the railway lines highways, and then we don't have to muck up our cities at all, which was actually expensive, but actually a really nice solution. And if you'd done it now, we could actually just transfer those all into bus lanes, and we'd all probably, bike lanes rather, and all be very happy. Marshall Rich. So he's actually saying, well, you know, the amount of money, at the moment roads are paid for by the motorists, that is actually not enough money. This is an issue that doesn't just affect motorists, it affects our actual city. And we need to put more money into it to have a solution that's going to last into the future and create a better transport system for everybody, because it affects everybody. And the last speaker, Burbank QC, was really just saying, you know, we need to have one central authority. There's too many people involved in roads in this state. It's confused, nothing ever happens, it's inefficient, and there's conflicts in decision making. And yes, the economic advisor says, you know, we need to spend more money. Okay, so what were the outcomes of the symposium? Definitely increased lobbying by RACV on key issues raised in the conference. There was a continuing education of members via Royal Auto articles. So that was a circulation in excess of 300,000 at the time, which is large. It really helped persuade Melbourne authorities to follow the American model of transport planning. That was really a really clear outcome, and I'm sure that would have happened anyway. But you know, there was a lot of noise about this topic at the time through the symposium. And of course, the next Melbourne Metropolitan Transportation Study predicted massive increases in traffic volume, proposing over 300 miles of urban freeways, and it was the most ambitious transport planning scheme of all the states in the 60s and 70s. Another sort of incidental outcome is that Kenneth Meyer decided to actually sponsor young Australian traffic engineers to go and study at Yale. And they studied with Wilbur Smith, who was sort of the American highway expert. So there was a direct route in terms of education that new Australians in this discipline, in this profession, were actually trained in the American methods. I just want to finish by just showing you some images from the Royal Auto magazine directly following the symposium, showing you some, they're sort of like the before and after, or we could have this, we've got this, images. So looking at effective bypass roads in Toronto, Johannesburg freeways, and on the left we have Melbourne. Melbourne going to work, you've got trams, you've got cars parked on the side, you've got a whole lot of traffic congestion, and it's a problem. Constantly very direct headlines like this, looking at the problems, inadequate highways. Our roads have to be used at their full capacity. So, you know, a lack of clear ways at peak hour was a key concern. We need to use the road space that's available. Many, many examples. One road authority is needed in Victoria. And of course, you know, it was this period of, there was a huge change that happened in this very short period. So, you know, as we know, in the early 1950s, 1 in 5 people owned a car. Less than a decade later, it was 1 in 3. In the early 1950s, a fifth of Melbourne's workers travelled to work by car. In the mid-60s, it was 2/3. So this problem of traffic congestion was very real. The solutions that were needed were very real, But this debate over do we preserve our cityscapes and our pleasant urban environment, or do we actually have efficiency in transport, but there's some sacrifice in terms of things like air quality, the livability of our suburbs and so on. Yes, so thank you.